Welcome. I'm Steven Henry Madoff, the chair of the MA Curatorial Practice program at the School of Visual Arts in New York City, and we're here for the launch of our new online journal, which you can see, the Curatorial, and I have with me, I'm honored to have Terry Smith, who has contributed to the first issue and is on the advisory board of the Curatorial. Terry is an eminent historian of modern art, a leading critic of contemporary art, a prominent analyst of curatorial practice, a pioneering critical theorist of contemporaneity. And Terry has given me some of the books, but it's an endless list of publications that Terry's done over time. His books, Making the Modern, Industry, Art and Design in America in 1993, What is Contemporary Art, 2009, Thinking Contemporary Curating, 2012, and Antinomies of Art and Culture, Modernity, Postmodernity, Contemporaneity, edited with Okwe Enwezor, and Terry will speak about Okwe soon, and Nancy Condi, that was from 2008. And these are widely regarded as landmarks in each of these fields. The Architecture of Aftermath, 2008, Art to Come, Histories of Contemporary Art, 2019, and Iconomy, Towards a Political Economy of Images, 2022-2023, have established him as a leading interpreter of contemporary visual cultures. So it's great to have Terry, and what we're going to do tonight essentially is we're going to walk through, I'm going to talk about why the curatorial, and then Terry will speak further to the issues of curating and the curatorial. Why are we coming back to that notion of the curatorial now, which, as Terry will talk about, is a term that's been used for quite a number of years. Maria Lind, who is on our faculty at large, is one of the authors of that, thinking about the notion of the curatorial. So the site itself is a site that is broken up into the sections that you see. Critical curating thinks more theoretically about curating, and I'll just show you. So these are, for example, the two pieces we're launching with. Carolina Rito is a theorist, curator, scholar in the UK. Henk Slager, who, by the way, is my guest tomorrow in the Curatorial Roundtable, and Henk is in Utrecht, is a widely known curator and thinker about artistic research and curatorial practice. So these are pieces which address the kinds of issues that we're thinking about theoretically these days. Algorithmic State is a section. We're starting with a piece by Amira Gad, who's an Egyptian-French curator who is currently the conservator of modern and contemporary art at Museum Boijmans van Beuningen in Rotterdam. And she's giving a kind of overview of the concerns around digital art, certainly in the new era of AI, and how that's impacting not only artistic practice, but curatorial practice. And we'll go back. The lexicon is where we are, in fact. There's a group that I'm a part of, and that, in fact, Henk is a part of, which is an international working group around the idea of curating and teaching curating. So we're beginning with these two sets of terms, curating and the curatorial, exhibition and exhibitionary, and we're developing with others over time distinctions between these two ideas. Mick Wilson and Vipash and Carolina are all part of this workshop, this curatorial workshop, which is part of EARN. And EARN is a European group that thinks about artistic research. Same thing with the exhibitionary. Catalin is also part of the group, a Romanian scholar and Hongzhen is in Taipei. So that's also important to the character of the Curatorial, that it is a truly international academic journal that thinks about theory and practice. Walking and Talking is a section in which Bige Or, who is the longtime head of the Istanbul Biennial and is now an independent curator and thinker who is doing videos with curators around the world. She is in London and Istanbul, and she's inviting curators, and these are videos in which they're each walking through their cities and talking about curatorial issues and practices. And on site is a section in which what we're doing is we're reviewing exhibitions around the world, but we're doing it from the perspective not of the art, but of the curating of the exhibition itself and their critiques. And by the way, this is a special thing for our program because it's an invitation to students in the program to contribute. So, for example, Tom Koren is a Fulbright scholar from Haifa in the program now, and she's done this critique of the Edge of Ailey exhibition at the Whitney. And last is a section that I somewhat whimsically have called roulette. And the idea of roulette is that it's a throw of the dice, a chance subject which is not specifically in the purview of the sections I've just discussed, but can be anything. So, in fact, Terry contributed the first piece to roulette, and that is what the site is about. And the question of why to do this. There are not many journals, there are just a couple really in the world that focus on curating as a subject. And so it seemed to me that there was room to do this. There is one wonderful journal, Dorothy Richter in Berlin now, who was at Zurich University of the Arts, has a great journal called On Curating, and in fact, our program edited a special issue of that. And then really, there is just not a lot of deep thinking about curating online. And so it makes sense out of our program, master's program, thinking about curating and curatorial practice to do it. So that's the curatorial. And with that, I am going to hand things over, since the last thing I spoke of was roulette with Terry, to turn things over to Terry. And this is where my own challenge comes in. So we'll do that. Okay.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Steven. It's great to be here. Let's see how far this can move so I can actually reach my slideshow. It's a pleasure to be part of this program. It is, as you say, oh, you didn't say it, but it is, I can say, coming from Australia and travelling around the world, one of the leading curatorial educational programs in the world, if not the leading anyway. It's one that the students here I've met are fantastic. They enjoy what they're doing. They're always challenged. It's always challenging to speak here, to meet with students, and to be led by someone who's thinking not just about the basic teaching of curating, but about what it is to educate people about curating, what curating itself is, and how curating functions within what I call the exhibitionary complex, which is what I'll talk about a little bit later on. But I'll spend a few minutes telling you how I rolled the dice, if you like, in the roulette, and make some remarks at this launch. So take up the lexicon. Let's take up the idea of lexicon, because one of the major definitions of it was the one you see here from Maria Lindt. Is there something we could call the curatorial, as she says, a way of linking images, objects, people, locations, etc. And she's looking for something that is more than what curators normally do, which is care for collections and make exhibitions. She thinks that something more than that is happening in the world and has appeared. We're looking in the early 2000s. We've got a little echo and boom going on here, but we'll work our way through it. And clearly she's drawing a parallel to, as she says, Chantal Mouffe's very useful distinction about what she called agonistic politics, not antagonistic politics, but agonistic politics, where your practice of what she calls the political can operate not just within the ordinary frameworks of public politics, party debates, the monstrosities that we're experiencing coming out of Washington at the moment, not just that level, but in some ways what we're also experiencing coming out of Washington, that everything can be political. Personal experience, institutional practice, any relationship can become politicized. So she's recognizing that, but in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a certain innocence to that idea. And the assumption that that kind of political focus would be a constructive, positive kind of practice rather than contested and largely negative political we're getting from Musk and his Muskettes. So I'll take something about the original concept. As I've just said, the original concept was really based on a distinction between curating, the ordinary practice, traditional practice of creating collections, looking after them, making exhibitions, caring for artists, caring for art, the core practice of curating. So the curatorial could add to that, supplement that, she said, and be this practice of kind of personal politics and collective politics, and be a kind of critical politics. And similarly, there's a distinction between exhibiting and the exhibitionary that's going on here. And what I think she's looking for, although it's never quite explicitly said, is the sense that curating could be a first order practice parallel to the making of art. Literally, it sounds strange to say now, but up until the 90s, everything focused on artists as the core generators, the core creators, and every other practice, curating, criticism, art history, administration, everything else was second order. And what's become obvious during the last few decades is that the first and second order practices have exchanged and interchanged a lot. Artists have taken on, as part of their own practices, elements from all the other disciplines that relate to art, the so-called support structures. Artists have been curators, critics and thinkers, theorists, historians, and so on and so forth, in a slightly different way from the way they're done at the core of each of those professions. But the interchange between these professions and between theory, making theory, or critical theory and philosophy, and curatorial and artistic practice have merged in many ways. Not everywhere, but for certain artists. And the artists who have, in a way, been agenda setting and definitive. So some larger kind of questions come up. It's now like, a whole generation, 25 years longer, since this distinction was made. So why is Steven going back to this now? And on top of that, it's not just a question being asked in the same way as it was in the 90s, in the early 2000s, because clearly what I call the visual arts exhibitionary complex has grown massively. So every element, starting with the quantitative number of artists, but then every other aspect of all the platforms, all the sites, all the places, all the institutions that support the making of art and the exhibiting of art, the exhibiting of art, the removal of art's inhibitions, All of those things have expanded massively, quantitatively, and expanded all over the world. They've been driven by larger world historical transformations. And so the curatorial, if it's going to operate now, will have its small focused moments and will have its small-scale collective moments, but it's operating in a framework that's much richer, much more connected, much more dense, and so on and so forth. So I just want to explore a couple of examples of curatorial practice of the kind that's extremely contemporary, and also explore some of the problems that can occur because our exhibitionary complex is now so integrated with all the other kinds of exhibitionary complexes that operate in the world. Public politics is a kind of exhibitionary contest of values and ideas and contest for power, if you like. There's a whole domain or field of exchanges between sexualities, if you like that, ways of being, and so on and so forth. Art and its exhibiting is one part of this whole network of connections and relationships. And they keep coming up in different sorts of ways. So I want to really look at just a couple of core examples that I'm very familiar with of an artist and a curator working together to produce a very significant work of art. The first example is, in a way, quite traditional. This is Ellie Buttrose from the Queensland Art Gallery, Queensland Museum and Gallery of Modern Art in Australia, and Archie Moore, who's an Indigenous artist, or an artist with very complex Indigenous background, but also some Scottish and Irish and ancestry as well. And he created a work for the Venice Pavilion, the Australian Pavilion at Venice, as you see here. That's our pavilion. It's a total black box inside of which there's a white cube, right on one of the small subsidiary canals. It's very heavy duty, very square. That's as you see, the view from the canal, but then the main entrance where you walk into it. But what you see when you walk in, or you did in 2024, was this quite extraordinary installation. So you're coming in through the door, you see on the right, you're seeing on the table, this white table, a pile of documents, many of which are, in fact, unreadable. Some are readable, other ones aren't. You're seeing that suspended above this reflecting pool, and around you, inside this fundamentally just square box, he painted the entire wall with chalkboard, like as if it's in a school, blackboard paint, and then by hand drew a series of markings and shapes, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So the first thing you focus on, the first thing you see are these documents floating in space. It's as if it's a sort of, post-conceptual installation, Joseph Cassou's first investigation, lots of documents on a table, except in this case you can't sit around and read them. You approach them and look at them, and you gradually realize that they document the deaths in custody of Indigenous people within Australia. It's one of our great national shames that we have 300,000 or 400,000 Indigenous people in Australia. We have many thousands of them incarcerated, particularly younger people. They die in a proportion relative to white people dying in custody that just is unmeasurable. We've had an investigation going since 1993 into the causes and so on. Not one of the recommendations have been followed. So the documentation is there, including some of Archie's own family who were caught in the prison system at a certain point, and other documents are empty. So what that creates is what I call a white city of death, right? A floating white city of death, because it's on a memorial space above this reflecting pool. a sort of, 9/11 of it in its own way, for Indigenous people, but shown, who are obviously mainly black, but it's shown as this white city of death. But it's framed, as I said, by this understanding that you can see that he's here. He's talking about kith and kin, which sort of, as I said, means friends and family, but it can also mean your countrymen, he thinks, and it can also mean, for Indigenous Australians, it can also mean the land, because Indigenous Australians actually are born from the land, the ancestor figures moving across the land in relation to their actual biological parents. So they are in fact products of both the land created by the ancestors and their own, the bodies of their own parents. And he's feeling, as you can see, as you read through this, that there's a larger picture here, that an Indigenous relationship to land and to country, and that's the phrase they use, small c, country, has something to teach everybody about what it is to share in a community in a coeval fashion. So his own parents, he doesn't represent them. He gathered some notes around the whole thing and included images of them, but there's no representation of individuals in this display. Instead, what he does is draw, in terms of an ancestral tree, he draws from the bottom up through a whole series of family connections, using many terms that are applied to Aboriginal people. HC means half caste. There's one person stillborn. There are names given to people. And then gradually, as you move up and through and get higher and higher, you'll see more and more Indigenous names present. And then Indigenous tribes take over until he's imagining he could trace his ancestry back 60,000 years through all the Indigenous peoples of Australia. And in effect, they're connected back to Africa, so they're all connected. Everyone's connected to each other. So that's his artistic vision, and that's a very powerful thing which Ellie, as a curator, supports. So in this case, I don't think we have an example of the curatorial on her part. We have it on his part, but not so much on her part. She's doing a traditional thing of supporting him in making his work. I know we've discussed it, I've discussed it with both of them, they talked a lot to each other, but it's his vision that that the work embodies. And you see, finally, just as he finishes the thing, after I think 3 months of drawing this thing by hand, he finally gets to the point where he puts his own name in, me, and then leaves lots of blanks around. So that's a work, I think, that makes really important statement. It's got the holes, the sun, well, the black hole you see up there is a kind of void. It's a void of lack of knowledge or lack of information, which isn't it's just necessarily a negative thing, but it's kind of there. So this is a brilliant layering. It's a brilliant way of conceiving and in all the contradictions of Australian society, profound and deep racial, racist contradictions, embodied in this way that is universally readable, and so you may well know that it won the prize for the best work in the Biennale, which was unanimously given. I heard from the jury that it was just obvious who was going to win this prize at that time. So that's one moment. Let me move to another one that's happening right now. The next Biennale representation for Australia, the one to come up in next year, was chosen by the what we call Creative Australia, which used to be called our Australia Council. So it's an official government body in which curators get together with artists, they put in proposals, There are expert committees put together, make recommendations. It's all focused, and then finally the council itself, which is responsible for a whole lot of different arts, decide on who gets to represent Australia. And the kind of work, not the detailed work, but the core idea of the work is presented to this council, and they choose, and it's announced. And we were all delighted to know that, in fact, the two artists who I've just shown you, well, Khalid Sabsabi and Michael D'Agostino. So Khalid is an artist based in Sydney. He's his family originally Lebanese. He came as a very young man from Lebanon, a very large Lebanese community in Sydney, and he lives very much in that area. Michael D'Agostino, also of Italian background, a curator, again in what we call our western suburbs, the outer suburbs of Sydney, who's now running the main museum at the University of Sydney, where I also teach. They put in their proposal. They couldn't go into details, but they made it very clear. They were saying it will be an inclusive place, a place that brings people together, and in fact a kind of nurturing place. So they wanted to follow with the spirit of what Archie Moore did in his show. It's kind of a dialogue. We don't know how much of the curatorial operates, but it's both the artisan and curator are very good, very experienced at curating their own work. And it's important for me to tell you that the head of the Creative Australia really endorsed this whole proposal, saying it will reflect the diversity and plurality of Australia's rich culture. It will spark meaningful conversations with audiences around the world. So just to let me give you a sense of Khalid's kind of work. This is a piece he showed at the Museum of Contemporary Art a few years back, well, quite a few years back now. A work consisting of flags from the different factions within Lebanon, and created in such a way as that they, instead of spiraled into the chaos that we associate with Lebanon, they actually created this space together that, to him, focused a kind of equality of presentation, not just of general national symbols, although you see the Lebanese cedar there, but of the particular groups gathering together to create a kind of Lebanon that is not confined by the formal division of the country into the Christian, Muslim and Hezbollah 1, 2, 3 representation that has crippled the country politically for so many years. So that's the kind of work he does, and you saw from his quote just before, he has certain views about Palestine. So you won't be surprised to know, in our current circumstances, that a member of the Liberal Party, and in Australia that is equivalent to Republican, so the Reactionary Party, posed a question in the Parliament. So with such an appalling anti-Semitism in our country, and there is an outbreak of anti-Semitic activity, which has many different causes, including externally provoked, but nonetheless there's a low-level amount of anti-Semitism in Australia, and it has appeared more recently in recent times, like similar hateful behaviour occurring in this country and elsewhere. But in this case, that's being weaponised by the opposition, and we currently have a Labor Party or a Social Democratic Party in power. The Conservative opposition is finding every possible opportunity to accuse government, led by Prime Minister Albanese, of being anti-Semitic. So as you see, why have they chosen an artist who celebrates the leader of Hezbollah? And in fact, what she's doing is referring to an installation many, many years ago when Khalid basically tracked the way in which many people in Lebanon celebrated the leader, Hezbollah leader, as if he was a god. And then he kind of deconstructed that idea as well. But of course, this lady chose one instance, stilled videos, and stilled a whole complex processual work into one image that looked as if he was turning the leader of Herzberg into a saint of some kind. And then he also made a work that's quite a striking work called Thank You Very Much, in which he juxtaposes images of 9/11 with a speech by George Bush when he says, "Thank you very much, thank you very much." So it's bang, 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 bang. It's an earlier work where Khalid's trying to, again, comment on media and how media works in such circumstances. Now, of course, that's led to a situation in which the people who were celebrating Khalid and his work just a few weeks ago suddenly decided that that's it. They're not going to proceed with the team. They've been sacked. And then they produce this statement about being an advocate for freedom of artistic expression, which, by the way, is in their charter. They must support freedom of artistic expression. These are what we call weasel words. Right? Weasel words. Words that sound great when you actually destroy the thing that you're talking about, artistic freedom. That's clearly what's been destroyed here. And that's led to the situation where the Minister for the Arts, who's someone I know and admire, is being caught in a situation where he obviously can't interfere with an independent body, but he first can celebrate Khalid being appointed. Now he has to support a situation where the council has stepped away from where they are. So it's awful. So that sort of that kind of contrast has brought us up against the issues that we're kind of facing today, and the ones that I gathered together in my contribution to the curatorial. I won't go into all these in detail because we'll be here for an hour. But to me, it's really important for artists and curators and everyone, all of us involved, not only to focus on the specific interactions that generate new creative ideas in terms of mediums and exhibitionary relationships and so on, but to bear in mind that we're operating in a world in which questions about the nature of what it is to be now are being asked in very specific ways. So I won't look at them in detail. You'll be able to look at them online because I discuss them in a lot of detail. When we, black shirt in the White House, a black shirt in the Oval Office, right? This is a situation that's framing at the moment a lot of what we're thinking. And I want us to speak not just against the specifics of what Trump and Musk are doing and the fallouts that are going to occur and already started to occur within the arts, but really instead focus just my last set of remarks on the fact that the people and the institutions and the practices of curating and those of art making, those of art history, art writing, and all our professional practices and so on, all our teaching, are in fact much stronger than what's being thrown at them at the moment. They've been around for longer, they'll last longer, they're amazingly what we call self-correcting. They're self-recreating, regenerating, and they're self-correcting. At the moment, Musk and Trump are doing a dose of correcting what they see as an absolutely corrupt thing they call government. But within that, there'll be structures that will outlast them. When it comes to the area in which curators operate, a few years ago I made this simple list starting from the top left going to the bottom, then back up to the top right and down to the bottom, of all the places where artworks are exhibited. And if you make that list, you find 47 different kinds of places where artworks are exhibited. This is the domain in which curators work, right? All of these domains. They're all, on the upper left, you can see a whole series relating to museums and institutions of continuous or stable kind. Then obviously there's the whole commercial sector doing what it does. Biennials have evolved as themselves a form that shares qualities with the other forms but have their own now powerful history. Then continue along and look up top right hand corner, all the artists run deinstitutionalizing independent creative organisations, and then all the forms of public art that also go on, popular public art that have been occurring. So I've been writing about these and thinking about these in a series of books, including one, The Curating the Complex, The Open Strike, that Steven published as part of his series. And in the last few years, I've become really aware that these institutions and relationships generate values, right? They generate important, significant values in their own terms and then in relationship to each other. And again, in my essay, you'll find discussion of these things, and particularly in the book, the Little Yellow Book, which is written for curatorial students, you'll find descriptions of how all of these things connect and where everyone relates to everybody else. But my big point is that these, we have this complex, it's not a military industrial complex, but it is a visual arts exhibitionary complex, and it will last as long and outlast, one hopes, these other ones. I'll just conclude with a few examples of how I think I've seen some curators operate within this complex over the past 3 or 4 decades as it's grown and grown and grown and grown and grown. So if you want an example of the curatorial operating in Maria Lind's terms, this critical inquiry through exhibiting works of art in particular ways that makes their points, it's hard to go past the work of Okwui Wazor, whose writings I'm editing into a couple of books at the moment, and they'll come out in August. But there's Okwui as a very young man, standing next to someone who was then Prince Charles, and then a couple of other people from the I love this photograph because neither of these two men want to be where they are, and neither of them obviously want to talk to each other. They have no interest or respect for each other at all, but nonetheless they're going through their form. A significant thing is that Okwi's made the future king walk through a work by Gu Wenda that's totally devoted to coeval communality, a work made out of human hair, generating language shapes that are not specific to languages but are kind of shared languages, and surrounded by African hair down below, a sort of absolute United Nations kind of work. And Okwui did that sort of thing in many of his exhibitions. Steven and I have kind of debated about this particular Biennale as probably an overload, which most exhibitions were at that time. But it did have a very powerful thematic of taking us through world currents, major world historical currents, things that are changing in the world at the time. And at a certain level, when an exhibition has enough support and enough money and enough space to take on a picture of what is the world condition now, is something that can be done in exhibitions. Obviously not all and not always, but that can be an obligation of the really super duper major shows. We can also see the emergence of indigenous perspectives, like the Archie Moore example gives, and we see in Niren Brooke Andrews, an artist curator of the Sydney Biennale in 2022. That's a couple of spaces from in, and this is international indigeneity, right? So the connections between indigenous peoples, who are really the most oppressed in the world, they're forming much stronger bonds between themselves. They're generating more and more art. And again, the quantity and the quality and the depth and the interest and the subtlety of art that's being generated from places where it never used to come from up till the 80s, the 1980s, is very powerful. And again, that's embodied in the works by Archie that I showed you before. Curatorial can also operate as process, and Maria herself, when she curated the Guangzhou Biennale, she devoted a whole chunk of it to bringing together people representing lots of different contemporary art spaces, artist organisations, non-profit organisations, and made a kind of horizontal connectivity as opposed to the standard hierarchies that operate in much of the art world. And that was a part of her making the curatorial obvious within an exhibitionary complex, within a specific exhibition. And similarly, the great question of whether what we call AI, which is shorthand for a whole range of ways in which human written programs have been written such that they will reproduce themselves and perhaps generate their own future programming. If we take that to mean what when we use the words AI, tracking that as an operation which is very largely photographic and very largely image-based, but also not image-based, not visual image-based, tracking that from the perspectives of the ways in which we curate art and curate visual cultures and so on, that people like Trevor Paglen and Kate Crawford do, that's also a kind of curatorial practice that I think is important now. So I'll just conclude by referencing back to Curating the Complex in the Open Strike book, which I'm happy to say Margarida Savrier has just translated into Portuguese, and that's available in Portuguese with Steven's introduction there as well. And the open strike idea is really the key idea that I mentioned earlier. Yes, we have to oppose the kind of oppressions and the reactionary intimidations, and in fact the incipient fascism that's emerging, let's say the not so incipient authoritarianism in the name of the people, which authoritarianism always uses the name of the people to oppress the people. That's occurring in the world today in many different ways. It's crucial not to withdraw our artistic labour and to stop creative imagination and to stop curatorial practice as such. It's absolutely crucial to keep the practices going while at the same time you get out on the streets or you do whatever's necessary to do the political work that's appropriate to the place that you're in. It's not one or the other. If you give up your practice, you've lost. You have to do both, okay? So that's it. That's what I want to say.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to make a couple of comments, and then if somebody wants to ask something, that would be great. So I think that what Terry had done in that book and also extended in this essay for the new journal really points to the kinds of thinking that we've always been doing in this program to do with social activism, to think about the idea that if curating is a form of research as well as a form of knowledge production, then the way that we think about it within an ethics of care relates directly to the political. Right. And Maria, early on was thinking about that, and interestingly showing the 2016 biennial that she did, of course, also brings up the last documenta. Right. And the way that Ruin Grupa then engaged also in the idea of collectivity, and that the power of politics for curators, for artists, for cultural producers is in fact one that is not hierarchical, but is one that exists within what you've laid out as the VAEC, the Visual Arts Exhibitionary Complex. So pointing to that slide, which of course amusingly has the child of Musk, which, you think about the future empire, makes me think that, and I've said this, of course, to the students in the program and the colleagues, that the importance now of what we do, of our thinking about the curatorial in larger terms, which imbricates politics and power in different ways, but is also about just the daily practice, has now taken on a kind of urgency, because what Trump is doing is so shocking. Shocking in that he is actually practicing what he swore in various ways in his last administration, but now. But what it's doing now is destroying the idea of destroying education, destroying diversity, equity, and inclusion, destroying the terms of gender difference, or reducing them male, female only. All of these concerns feel that they are the subject of the curatorial. So I wondered if you have a further comment about that, and then we could open it to questions.
So I was at Documenta just a couple of days after the opening, Documenta 15. My wife and I were there when they just removed the large painting by Towering Padai that actually had a couple of very nasty little anti-Semitic figures painted in it. Absolutely no question, awful, nasty images in it, amongst about 500 images of which were not nasty or anti-Semitic in the same painting, by the way. But nonetheless, that was there. We found that Documenta to be obviously very variable if you're looking for great works of art, but to be, in a way, the most interesting and enjoyable as an experience of going from place to place. And obviously, the committee that chose Ruan Grupa, out of a whole series of others, chose them because they'd already established a record of making exhibitions like they did at Sonsbeck and various other places, that brought communities together and brought them together in interesting and positive and constructive ways. Now, clearly Ruan Grupa said, let's do this on a world scale. Let's kind of bring together all the people within the visual arts exhibitionary complex, or examples of them, in that area which I talk about as the not-for-profit, generative, or what I call deinstitutionalizing, right? You're connected to institutions, but you deinstitutionalize them as much as you can, right? That kind of dialectic of institutionalizing and creating and deinstitutionalizing. So let's give these people the platform, the field, and from all over the world to come and do their thing, which is what they did. And to me, the committee with Otto Medabo and other people on it made a wonderful gesture to try and bring that logic to the heart of Europe, which Europe really needed, and Documenta really needed that kind of logic. And that understanding that it's not a hierarchy, that it is this field, like I've explained, that runs everywhere in the world. So it ran brick wall into the absolute fear of people subject to anti-Semitism, which is absolutely understandable. But what that's been turned into, and the echoes also operated within Australia, in the case of the banning of the work by Khalid Sasabi, on the grounds that he was probably sympathetic to Palestine. What's that turned into? I mean, a genuine hatred of anti-Semitism can turn into this machine, this censoring machine that's almost totalizing and kind of instantly generated by trolls and people like the senator who I just showed you, for their local political reasons, without caring about the larger kind of consequences and the fact, like you said, they've reduced and demeaned and turned into a formula. It's a very complex question of anti-Semitism. As it turned, what encourages me though was that's the most popular documentary amongst younger people that's ever been, who really celebrated that documentary. It's also the case that it managed to find some way forward with Naomi Beckwith doing the next one. Let's see what happens. Whether we'll be able to find a way forward in Australia, I hope that, because as it turned out, all of the other curators and artists who put up proposals have said, we don't want to take the place of the people who were dismissed, please put them back in. As far as I can see, no one in Australia is going to put up a proposal. We could end up with an empty pavilion, which would give the look of a strike of artists. But it's not an absence in that sense. It's an absence from the core of a moment of institutionality, if you like. So I'm hoping, because it's only been a couple of days, and there's been an enormous response, including very courageous, and I must say a very positive word about a man called Simon Mordaunt. So Simon has been a wonderful supporter of the visual arts in Sydney, including of the Venice Biennale Pavilion itself, which he funded a lot of. He's been a commissioner. He was going to fund the work by Khalid. He's obviously of a Jewish background, but nonetheless he was going to do it. As soon as the cancellation occurred, he objected and withdrew his money, right? Withdrew his support. So we have models of people who can understand everything that's at stake, and even at a personal cost, they will stand up and be principled as supporters and donors, not just as artists. So that's what has to happen. When you say Trump is destroying, they are beginning to try to do all that destruction. How far it will get depends on whether people will respond in the ways that I've just suggested, that whether we actually do an open strike, we object, but we keep doing our work, right? Keep doing our work according to the same principles and spirit, that's it, and object politically in the ways specifically that we need to. So it's not either or. Okay.
Well, and of course we're talking about the US and Australia, but authoritarian regimes are all over the world. The same kinds of issues are taking place everywhere. So I'm going to ask if anyone here has questions. It seems that there are also questions from the online audience. And maybe let's see if anyone here first has something, and then we'll go into these questions. Anyone? Everyone is being shy in our audience.
I have a question, but I will
Please.
wait for our audience first. Let's hear from you.
Please, no, go ahead.
Thank you very much for this presentation, all of you. And I think it was important and interesting to look into the examples from the Venice Biennial, particularly thinking about the context, how Venice Biennial was created, how we were looking into this notion of nations, etc., when it was created. And after all this time that the entire critique of nations has been done, we are back to some sort of point where we are representing all these authoritarian issues, and it's interesting how it reflects in the biennial, such as there's a war and, for example, Russia has to close the pavilion, or what happens like between each pavilion, depending on whatever happening in these countries, they are represented in one way or the other in these pavilions. And of course, there were times where we were able to be critical about our own nations and national problems within the nation-based exhibition making. But on the other hand, a lot of us are suffering from all of these authoritarian issues so long. To me, for example, coming from Turkey, experiencing all the, especially the Gezi protests, etc., then having moved to US, then encountering very similar problems starting here, we see that, as you said, Steven, most of these problems are very global. And as you said, yes, we need to keep working, but on the other hand, we have to realize that all of these global issues have important connections between each other. The authoritarianism is one of them. Police violence that comes with it is another. And then, of course, the first thing we lose is the freedom of expression, and how we are not even able to have this artistic expression anymore in the most critical art-making context. So with that view in mind, yes, as curators and cultural producers, we have to keep working and doing whatever we have to do. But how do you see the role of art institutions and museums in this sense? Under the authoritarian regimes, especially with the prospect that we have all these fundings from these nations, and then all of a sudden our critique is against that nations, and all this contradiction between where the money comes from, what we criticize, and how we function within these institutions.
Okay, so it's paradoxical. The modelling in Venice of all the national pavilions, it's very striking, but particularly since the 90s at least, and in many cases earlier, one national pavilion after another has shown work that's actually critical of the mythologies of the host nation. You could even say that in 1964, when Rauschenberg won the prize and Leo Castelli basically brought a whole bunch of extra paintings in and did this deal using the US Air Force that won him the prize. Nonetheless, Rauschenberg's works were relatively critical of United States mythologies at that time, relatively critical. And particularly if you continue on, I mean, that's actually become more the norm at Venice over the years. Nations within that context, and it's obviously a very subtle one, it doesn't work back home in Istanbul, but it could work, and actually in some ways has to work in these spaces where critically reflective ways of thinking about what it is to be a nation is pretty much the topic in almost every pavilion, and has been for many years. When that doesn't happen, it's striking and it's awful. Like the Italian pavilion about 4 or 5 times back was absolutely gross, full-bore Italian nationalist nonsense. And if even the Vatican pavilion, whatever. So there, that stands out. So it's what we're talking about here is, in a way, Venice Biennale is an institution that's in fact generated that capacity, and that's what is to be valued. It's certainly the case that when we have an authoritarian yes-no situation, the power, whoever has the most power, whoever's willing to be the most coercive, will win for that moment, at least for that time. And there is obviously worldwide a massive increase of authoritarianism. I think it's connected with the profound fear of climate extinction. I think the profound fear that's actually been generated around the world, people looking for strong leadership and so on. So these are factors way beyond the specifics of art practice, but there are factors we have to think about, and some artists and curators and critics are thinking about them. All the same principles apply to the institutions like art history departments and whatever, museums and all the rest of all of these issues are relevant to all of these. They're not relevant specifically the same way, but they're relevant in the way they're relevant to that place and things. So we could do a similar analysis if we were discussing, say, museums today, for example. We have to be a very similar sort of.
But I would say that part of the issue that we're now seeing, at least in the US, as Trump and Musk march through, is that the pressure on museums is such that it is inevitably going to have a chill on what curators and board members will do. We're even seeing the crazy example of his hostile takeover of the Kennedy Center, which he's put in charge someone who doesn't know a single thing about art at all. So I think that the question will be, you're very optimistic in saying we will outlive this. Of course we will, and of course, if you think as a collecting institution, curator, etc., well, those collections aren't going away, and the things that were collected, which in fact supported DEI, etc., are in the collections. And yet, what we have to face now as cultural producers is what we will do. What is the activism that we can do now? How will we enact it? Will we enact it in the face of what seems for the first time in the United States, at least since the 1930s, is a kind of punishment that the government will take out on its citizens, so that the kind of freezing of one's preferences, let's just put it that way, could mean you're frozen because you're afraid of jail time, etc. This is real. This is now real in the United States, just as you've been talking about it as other parts of the world. Now we're facing a terrifying prospect, at least.
Yeah. Let's see.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to read a question, which is, for some context, I'm an incoming student for the MA in art curatorship at the University of Melbourne, where I believe Terry studied decades ago.
I did.
In a nutshell, I would like to hear your thoughts on an aspiring curator and art historian's occasional thoughts of, quote, the grass looking greener on the other side, regarding how a career in exhibition making and for academia is better started in the other environments, not the least based on the awareness of the scene, sector, market, however we define or label it, in the US, is bigger, larger than, say, in Australia. Does that make sense? Is
I think
the
they're
end of this
asking
question.
whether one should go straight into a curatorial studies program or go and do something else, like art history or politics or whatever, and then come into the program with that kind of experience. Yes, the answer is yes.
Okay. I'm going to turn again. Are we sure that no one has a question?
I have more like
We'll hold on one sec.
Yeah, I have more like a comment on your journal and the importance of these kind of spaces in this particular moment, because we really need to hold think of freedom of expression as something that we really need to focus in, and I think that something like the journal is right in between of the exhibition space and the curatorial, for sure, and it's a way of breaking like the microtopia of maybe the exhibition space and what happens inside, and a way of really touching the world in a different way, and like getting into different crowds that maybe are not as close to art as they could. Also, yeah, we need to think of art in this moment not as something as a palliative care space for the world, but I think it's like a place of real resistance, especially now. So yeah, we know like the agency of art has its limits, unfortunately, but at the same time, we cannot forget that we need to keep battling for like freedom of expression and like these places for creating knowledge in different ways. So I think that what you're doing right now is very important. Yeah, I just wanted to say congratulations and looking forward to really
Good. Well, I mean, what I would say about the journal is we're just starting it. It's a growing creature, let's put it that way. Who knows, we're open to all kinds of essays, all kinds of thinking about what the curatorial and what curating are. It's coming out of a program which is called Curatorial Practice. And so even in this conversation, we're thinking about large issues, but we're also thinking about what can we do in a practical way, in a local way. So I think that the journal is a place that can be very open. On the other hand, I would say that there is a focus, at least for me as the founding editor of it, which is to say that this program has always been about activism and social justice. And so now it feels ever more pressing to have this platform, to have it for the students in the program as a place to publish. And of course, as I showed, it's populated already by writers who are from all over the world. So it's very open to an international, global discussion about these issues. Somebody did ask, well, how do we get to it? So it's one word, thecuratorial.net. That's the address, and so that's practical. And with that, I guess there is a question in the back.
Could I just ask about the name of the journal, the curatorial itself, and perhaps what?
Why is it named the curatorial? What? Well, to the conversation we've been having, I wanted a name that signaled in the most obvious way that it's very broad. It's not called like the program Curatorial Practice the Journal of Curatorial Practice. No, it's called the Curatorial because I want it to be capacious in that sense of allowing for all kinds of different forms of conversation. And I should say that the format right now, what I showed as the topics, that could, of course, grow. I would like there to be a section, for example, on issues around ecology and climate. And the idea, by the way, of the journal is it's not like a standard journal where once a month we'll bring out a new issue on a theme. No, those are the areas of focus to which we will keep adding pieces. And the lexicon is something that is going to deepen not only with those two terms, but we'll continue to deepen the terms that are used and interrogate them. And have, the reason that there are two columns is also to argue, to say, no, I don't think the curatorial means, here's another perspective, to open that conversation.
And have examples and advices about how to resist the oppressions to come.
Right. I mean, so Terry showed the image of, he was the first in the series that I am editing for Sternberg Press called Thoughts on Curating. And the idea of that series is to invite people to think through important subjects in the curatorial as a concept, as a broad concept, and that there's a relationship between the journal and the series. And, obviously that's going to continue over time. So in fact, ironically, maybe not ironically, it makes perfect sense that in a couple of months, Maria Lind is going to be here herself to do a conversation with Carolina Rito, who's one of the contributors to the journal, to go deeper into what we're calling rewiring the museum, thinking about the evolution of curating. So, Sam.
I think the interface and multiplicity is really interesting, especially considering Gillespie Federico's latest book, where you're forced to look at two catalogs of architecture and non-architecture works simultaneously. I found that very fascinating.
Great, good, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, with that, thanks everyone. Thanks everyone online. Thecuratorial.net. Thanks, Terry.
Done.